Welcome back to the Daily Drum on WHUR 96.3 HD2 and Sirius XM channel 141. I'm Harold Fisher.
At 10:29 a.m. this morning, we already had 71,054 people vote early today. It looks like this is going to be a record breaker for the first day of early voting. But we don't make predictions. We let the voters decide. But it looks like we're going to have strong early voting today.
Raffensperger, Secretary of State for Georgia. During a press conference this morning, he shared turnout numbers as the peach state begins early voting. There are just 3 weeks to go before Election Day, 21 days. And WHUR is committed to making sure you are armed and ready with the information and the tools you'll need to be an empowered voter. And tonight we continue that commitment with new information from the NAACP and its efforts to ensure that everyone who wants to vote can vote. The civil rights organization has filed nearly a dozen election-related lawsuits across Georgia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Texas, and more. So what's behind these lawsuits, and what are your rights as a voter leading up to and on Election Day? My guest is Tyler Sterling, National Director of Campaigns for the NAACP. Tyler, thank you so much for joining the conversation.
Thank you very much, Harold. Honored to be here. Thank you.
Sure thing. As I said, you heard Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State for Georgia, talking about the eye-popping numbers at just before 11 o'clock this morning. When you hear those big numbers, what does that mean to you?
Yeah. One, it is extremely exciting to see that we are seeing voters turn out at such high clips, in particularly a state where we have a very large Black voting population. As you spoke to just moments ago, of course, we are concerned about everyone getting their right out to vote and they're making an empowered and informed decision to show up to vote, but in particularly in a state like Georgia, as you alluded to, with the current ongoing lawsuits within the state, we are extremely excited to see that voters are turning out at a high clip. And I think that speaks to probably two things in particular about this election cycle. One, voters understand the importance of what is at stake on the ballot this year. And two, people are probably a little, they're used to getting those phone calls, those door knocks, and those text messages. And so if you vote early, your name ideally gets removed from those lists and you're probably not contacted as much. So I think it's a little both and. First and foremost, I think people are extremely aware of what is at stake and on the ballot this year in this election cycle. But two, because they understand what's at stake, those voters are probably at the top of everyone's list, NAACP included, sending them text messages, sending phone calls, and knocking on the door. So they know, and most voters know, as soon as you vote, your name gets removed from that list and you can kind of live in peace the remaining 21 days to this election cycle.
Yeah, let's hope so, because even as a journalist, I never knew that Donald Trump, nor did I think that Kamala Harris had my phone number. And so I've been hearing from both of them quite a bit. My new friend.
That's exactly right. I think that's exactly right.
Also, just kind of sticking with the news coming out of Georgia, I wanted to have you react to something that Gabe Sterling said, who is the COO for the Secretary of State's office.
Well, the fun part is I'm not a lawyer, but I have a lot of lawyers around me. And I have one very important lawyer, the Attorney General, Chris Carr, who wrote a memo to the State Election Board, who basically did the equivalent of a legal smackdown, saying these rules you are passing are not tethered to statute. So by definition, that means in many ways they've exceeded their authority.
So what he's talking about, I'm sure you're familiar with this news, the Fulton County Superior Court judge has ruled that county election officials cannot delay or refuse to certify election results. It was in an 11-page ruling. The judge said the local officials have a, quote, mandatory fixed obligation to certify the results. He also added that election officials should share any concerns about fraud with the appropriate authorities, but those concerns cannot be used as a basis to delay certification. your thoughts about that ruling coming down today?
Yeah. So, well, first, there is no relation between me and Mr. Gabe Sterling,
Well, of
but
course not.
the
Yeah.
the
Thank you for adding that. I appreciate that.
yeah, no, no problem at all. I think this is a win for democracy as a whole. The delayed process, or the what was outlined coming out of the state of Georgia, uh, was, in my intention, designed to stall or delay election results. On its face value, it is ruled that we cannot delay the certification or the delayed vote counts. And so, at its on its face value, it is a win for democracy, and below it's a win for democracy. Voters do not want to have this anticipatory phase where we are waiting to see who the winner is for the results of both the presidential election and all the important down ballot elections in the state of Georgia. And so, one, it is doing the civil rights, or not the civil rights, the civic engagement and the due diligence duties of our election administrators to hold free, fair, and responsive elections to make sure that we are getting results in a timely manner. That is on the first aspect. And then the second aspect, I think um, it is a great opening to make sure that those challenges that come post an election are not necessarily levied at the voters in Georgia, meaning that we will have an answer, and we'll have an answer for the presidential election and those down ballot elections shortly after all votes are counted. So I think it really, one, is a win in terms of anytime you are hand counting something at a crazy excessive amount of counting, you get three people locked in a room who have just had a very long day of voter turnout and such. You're going to come up with some inconsistencies. And so I think it is important that we are not delayed in those, but also that it does not open up the door for election deniers, to which will deny the fact that whoever wins out coming out of the state of Georgia, that individual should be notified, and the public should be notified of that win as soon as we are certain on those counts.
Let's talk a little bit about the election related lawsuits that the NAACP has filed. Kind of share with us what is behind these lawsuits.
Yeah, and so the NAACP, we are a policy advocacy organization, and so where we what that means is both the litigation aspects, the grassroots aspects, and then the kind of air game and ground game combined of advocacy, talking to members, talking to the general public. We are very fortunate to have 2,200 plus units across the country, and most in these areas, particularly in some of our southern states, in very rural areas that are largely African American and Black population areas. And so, as the NAACP, we look to stand up for all of our members, and in particularly communities of color. What is behind each of these, particularly in Georgia, ongoing lawsuits, or having filed motions and current lawsuits, is really an attempt to make transparency into the election process and to allow for every registered eligible voter to cast their ballot successfully. And that is really at its core of these lawsuits, is allowing for transparency into those being registered or told that they are registered, that they are able to vote, opening up for transparency on those that have been challenged on their voter registration status to understand more about those challenges. And then third, to allow for every eligible person to show up to vote. So the lawsuits themselves are focused in at the state level, but there are also some motions filed with our Georgia State Conference, NAACP, where we're looking to intervene on some individual person level lawsuits that are really essentially an attempt to disenfranchise thousands of voters in counties. And these counties in particular all have a population of more than 50% Black. So when you are looking at the turnout numbers, if you're able to disenfranchise a majority or a handful of counties that have over 50% Black population, you are really targeting Black voters. And so at its core, it is about allowing every eligible voter, and we really want to emphasize that eligible voter. We are not talking about hundreds of thousands or one, two, not a single voter that we are referring to is non-registered. Now, these individuals may have been registered and then wrongfully removed from the rolls, as we are seeing all across the country. So it's a forefront of both being on the positive or the offensive side to ensure that individuals that are on the voting rolls remain on the voting rolls up until election, but then also some defense to ensure that those that have been challenged or those that are currently facing obstructions to cast their ballot successfully are able to participate in our democracy.
What kind of success, if any, has the NAACP had in these challenges? It's my understanding, the courts have not necessarily been ruling in favor of these cases filed by the NAACP. Your thoughts on these rejections?
Yeah, we are seeing a rejection of democracy to a degree. While we have not always seen the most positive results coming out of the court system, these are the systems in place that we have, and we must play within the systems that we have, the rules that are allotted to us. So while on the forefront of the litigation aspects, everything that we do on litigation is followed and tailored up behind or followed behind on the grassroots advocacy. So where our success comes in is not always within the judicial system. It is making sure that we are letting that be known, filing motions, attaching on to lawsuits, making sure that we are in the litigation space, but really seeing gains on educating our communities. And by the NAACP being a trusted messenger, we can show communities that we're playing within the rules of the system that we have in front of us by showing up in court for you, but also knowing that regardless of the results of our injunctions, our motions in court, that we will be right there behind you, sending a text message, knocking on your door, giving you a phone call, sending a piece of mail, doing digital advocacy or digital ads to you to ensure that you have the tools. So really, it is not 100% different from the NAACP's founding in 1909. We are playing within the systems that are available to us, but also making sure that we are doing the grassroots advocacy and leaning on the trusted messengers that is the NAACP. We are nothing without our member leaders in a fully volunteer-run organization in our states. Want to really emphasize that the person that is telling you, hey, make sure you go early, make sure you have all of the necessary ID requirements that you may need to vote, is the person that you may see at the grocery store, the person whose son or daughter plays in your son or daughter's soccer league, or you at t-ball practice, maybe you worship together, but really leaning on the trusted messengers that are the NAACP to carry that message. So while we have not always seen the most success in the litigation aspects, we will continue to thrive on the ground organizing and almost in what we call in campaigns, a knock and drag aspect. I will knock on your door and drag you to the polls with me if I absolutely have to.
Let me, before I go to a break, briefly share some website addresses and what they will provide as far as tools, methods, messages, etc.
Yes, thank you very much. So naacp.org/vote is our main voter hub. We have everything on that website, from voter guides, which are really amazing C3 nonpartisan entities or guides that really lay out where the candidates stand on each issue. We are trying to put as much information in the voters' hands this year, because we know that our communities and all communities, but particularly communities of color, when it comes every 4 years to these presidential elections, we are subject to this mis and disinformation. And so trying to demystify some of the narratives that may be pushed out this election cycle by making sure every voter has the opportunity to know what is on their ballot, who the candidates are, where the candidates stand for, but then also having additional talking points and resources for those well-meaning individuals, that want to have a conversation with their nephew, their uncle, their niece, their family members. So we really tried to make sure that naacp.org/vote has all things on not only how to vote, ID requirements, polling locations, times of day, but the why to vote, the why aspects as well. So it's really an all-encompassing voter hub to find the resources on the why and how to vote, no matter where you reside in the country.
Hold that point. I'll let you continue on the other side. We're going to take a break, but don't forget you can hear this and every edition of the Daily Drum Insight segment via podcast on WHUR.com. The original Quiet Storm is next on WHUR. I'm Harold Fisher. This conversation continues on Sirius XM channel 141 and 96.3 HD2 in just a few seconds. Welcome back to the Daily Drum on Sirius XM channel 141. I'm Harold Fisher. We continue our discussion about voter education as we are doing every Tuesday leading up to Election Day on November 5th. Today, my guest is Tyler Sterling, National Director of Campaigns for the NAACP. Before the break, Tyler, you were talking about voter education. On the website, naacp.org/vote. I want to drill down a little bit more about voter education, civic engagement, a term that you spoke about earlier, and I was particularly struck with that and have been struck not just during campaign 2024, but I would say over the past 10 years. From your perspective, what is happening to civics education, not just for children that are in school, but it just seems, it almost seems like we need schoolhouse rock again for adults.
Yeah, no, that is a really great question, and in particular, not just the youth. So I'll put a pin in the youth and then speak of it in the adult context right now. I mean, if you think of it in terms of any profession that has continued education. So, continued medical education, continued legal education. These are fields in which you are practicing law, you're practicing medicine. We are practicing democracy. It is not a staple that we are guaranteed to have democracy, and so the NAACP seeks to do the education of the practice of democracy. Voting is one participatory aspect in civic engagement. And it is our intention to bring along those individuals that we newly register, that we get into the fold of bringing them in an election scope, to take them along the journey of civic engagement, to become a first time voter, to then become someone who testifies at your General Assembly on the local laws that really happen. We think about elections in such a national scope that sometimes I think we forget about the local election aspects, how often your trash is picked up, when your snow gets removed. These are real everyday things as to how individuals experience their local government. And so not only trying to take it from the 30,000-foot view of candidate A versus candidate B in presidential, in US Senate, in your gubernatorial elections, but really bringing it down to your county commission. Did you know that your county commission determines who gets that big water utility contract every 25 years or so? And oftentimes, in the times of presidential elections, those things are discussed, or those contracts become up for renewals, and the individuals in place are those responsible for picking who is your county's service providers and such. And so what we are attempting to do, and what we're doing through the NAACP, is not only educating on voting for voting for an issue, voting for turnout, but then moving that into conversations of, okay, step one is voting. Step two, getting others involved. Step three, going beyond the voting and being a member who speaks or testifies at your county commission hearings, who goes to the local school board meetings where you are able to hear from your school board officials what is being taught in your schools, or what are the issues that are on the plate. So as far as civic education for adults, again, we are very, very fortunate to have 2,200 plus units all across the country. And they do town halls, candidate forums, calls on both in-person and virtual calls around Project 2025. We're attempting to demystify some of the alphabet soup that is the how government works day in and day out, and getting resources to community, giving individuals a reason to vote, but then also expanding beyond that and saying, well, if a system or distrust or disengagement is happening within our communities, it can't be because we're only talking to folks every 2 or every 4 years about an election cycle. So the NAACP does this year in, day in, day out, year after year, to try and build the next generation of activists. And that next generation of activists, I don't mean age wise. You could be 67 plus who doesn't really engage in elections, but you found an issue that is really pertinent to you that pulls you to the forefront. Most activists in the sense of, civil and civic rights, find an issue that they care about and they follow that thread and that through line to take them to their next step or engagement of becoming an activist. I think oftentimes when we say activist, we think about black and white photos. We think about the NAACP in 1909. Think about the NAACP in 1960. But activists are those that are wanting to advance the rights, the political voice of all Americans, but in particular as the NAACP, as Black Americans in our communities. So we, through the NAACP, think of us as a continued civic engagement program year round for adults to engage in this process.
Yeah. When you talk about engagement, for example, one of the things that we have been hearing of late, particularly as it relates to, to Black men, about their lack of engagement in some cases, and some of the polls are suggesting that Black men plan to sit this election out. First of all, that's nothing new. We have, since I've been covering elections, and I'm ashamed to say, or maybe proud to say, I've been doing it for almost 40 years. There has always been an issue with Black men not being engaged. What are your thoughts about that in 2024? Do you believe the polls that they are not engaged? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we've got to kind of dispel, or I appreciate the question in particular on this word engage. What does it
Mhm.
mean? What does it mean to engage? Let's dispel any myths or wrong facts here in that, and not presented from you, from the narratives is what I mean by this. Of
Right. To vote or not to vote? That's the question.
exactly. Black men are consistently the second largest voting bloc in this country, just behind Black women. So when we say engage, I think what we need to have is a different conversation around the power of your vote. When we're talking to Black men, particularly Black men under 50, there is a core belief in some of these Black men, and some me included at times, is that, do you feel the power in your vote? Is your vote going to make a difference in the things that you necessarily care about? And so, what I think the NAACP and many other nonpartisan entity organizations, we try to tie the knots, or make the difference or the connections between the policies and progresses that you have seen in your community, whether we are talking about, student loan debt relief. And I know not everyone has student loan debt, but we can say that, in Black community, and we've seen this in our polling and our research, we have this sense of shared fate. And when I say shared fate, I mean my neighbor getting a win is not taking food off of my plate. So I should not be upset that my neighbor has gotten their debt relieved. It just may not necessarily speak to me. So that shared fate is something very, very big. But when we're talking about Black men and engagement, we've got to know right away that Black males are the second largest voting bloc in this country. Now, when we're talking about the direction of their vote, we need to really put some emphasis and some resources behind making the ties between your vote and the progresses or the successes that your community has seen. And so through the NAACP and through our messaging and toolkit research, can all be found on naacp.org/vote, are really the pieces as to the why to vote, why your vote does have power, outside of the fact that reproductive rights are on the ballot. And that's something we haven't gotten into just yet around, but voting for your family, voting for other individuals, and voting for your own progress. There are three things there. It is, how does my vote impact my life immediately? How does my vote impact my family's life? And then how does my vote impact my community? And so if we can tie those three issues to a successful reason of why your vote must be cast. That is what the NAACP is doing. So really talking about the issues brought forth by all candidates up and down the ballot as to who will be the best choice for you and your long-term future, not only that immediate emotional aspect or draw that you have where you may seem a bit discouraged with the current processes. It is all about tying the vote to long-term and the policies brought forth from your vote.
I want to go back to voting access for a moment, because again, this is really one of those issues that has come up in the wake of the natural disasters of Hurricane Helene and Milton. Initially, there were reports, for example, in North Carolina, that the state was not going to make allocations for those people who had been affected. And now some of the more recent reporting is that in North Carolina, they're going to make either mail-in ballots or access to ballots, while not necessarily extending, but trying to extend help, so to speak, to make sure that those people who were affected by the Hurricane Helene in North Carolina, can still vote. And of course, most recently, Florida's governor extended help to some 13 Western Florida counties. But it seems to me that there's this hodgepodge of, courts say no, and then the state step in. And even though, as we've seen in Western North Carolina and in Western Florida, these are not necessarily, there are some, but not necessarily a majority of people of color, but shouldn't this rising tide lift all boats?
Yeah, to the aspect or the comment on administrations, particularly governors' administrations, accessing or allowing for, we'll say allowing for more access to voting, it is immensely helpful. I mean, it is something that I think at its core, all of our elected officials should be advocating for is more participation into our democracy and allowing the that any registered voter who is eligible to vote is able to participate in our democracy. I think that is something that, regardless of where you stand, regardless of your position, being an elected official is something that we need to be advocating for. This aspect of will a rising the rising tide raise all ships aspect, I think that comes to the power of your vote question again, in
Mm-hmm.
feeling that if your community stands together and votes, that you are better off as a whole. So not necessarily not getting into who this impacts on the ballot, it's really about empowering communities. And I'd say, as I sit here in Northern Virginia, very untouched by any of the Helene or Milton disasters. If you are trying to figure out how to get ice into your home because your power has not been on and your food is going to go bad because you have leaks in your ceiling, because your belongings and your box of your pictures and your loved ones and that special place of things you keep is ruined, voting is the last thing on your mind right now. And so
Right. Yeah.
I think that it is important that we really acknowledge that and extend some human compassion. It is not something we see too often when it comes to voting and this electoral process, that we are extending compassion to all individuals who are under this immense amount of stress right now. We hear about it when we're talking about voter engagement all of the time. If you are unable to put food on your table, voting's probably not going to be at the top of your mind right now. It will certainly have an impact for your ability to put food on that table long term. But in the next 24 hours, you're not thinking about checking my voter registration, making a plan to vote. You're thinking about where that next meal is going to come from. And so I think at its core, it's about extending some human compassion. And we're very pleased to see that some counties have been granted that grace, where I think more counties need to be extended to be included into that.
You mentioned that you're in Northern Virginia. I wanted, your thoughts, from the NAACP's perspective about the whole voter purging issue. Obviously, that is a very recent, issue where the DOJ filed suit last week against the Commonwealth of Virginia for purging. We've seen the same kind of thing in Arizona. Without getting down into the weeds of the legalese, because every one of these cases is very, very different. But what do you say to a voter? Let's say there's a voter who's lived in Alexandria, Virginia, a Black male voter who has not voted since Bill Clinton ran or George Bush ran, the second George Bush, and is concerned because he decides that he wants to vote in the 2024 election. What do you say to him if he's concerned about his vote or his name being purged? And if someone finds that they aren't registered when they knew that they were registered 20 years ago and they've lived in the same place for the past 20 or 30 years, what do you tell them?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think these voter purges that are happening all across the country. You gave an instance of Virginia, of Arizona, in North Carolina. I think just 2 weeks ago, 200,000 individuals were removed from the voting rolls due to that inactivity. And so that inactivity is what we're referring to of having not voted. There's the grassroots approach, and then there's the advocacy approach. The grassroots approach that I would say to any individual who is saying, am I able to vote? I want to participate in this election. Verify your registration immediately. You can do so at naacp.org/vote, where we have tools for requesting an absentee ballot, verifying your registration, or registering for the first time. But also, first and foremost, is to make sure you yourself are registered. In most instances, in these purging cases, the action to essentially get yourself back on the active voting rolls is to vote. It is to show up to vote and to say, hey, in fact, I do still live at this address. Here is my proof of identification to confirm that, and I will be voting in this election cycle. In most instances, that is the solve for that. However, and it's fitting that we're discussing this right after the discussion on Hurricane Milton and Helene. County entities are required to indicate to these voters prior to or as they are being on the quote unquote purge list. And so oftentimes that is a piece of mail. We know right now, in particular, those western portions of Florida, western portions in Southwest and kind of into the middle of Georgia, all the way up to North Carolina, that these notifications may not have been received. Just calling it what it is. The notifications may not have made it to each and every one of these voters. And so it is the advocacy side, or the advocacy side of this, to make sure that where needed, those extensions or grace is extended, like the Western Florida, like Western North Carolina. So on the individual person level, it's kind of like they tell you as you're flying, you're getting ready to fly. Put your oxygen mask on before you can go help your neighbors and such. So check your registration first, and then do that with all of your family members. But on the advocacy side, that is where these hundreds of pages of legal documentation comes in, to make sure that not only are we doing this on a person-to-person basis, but that individual who may not hear this broadcast, who may not be available, who may not have a text message from the NAACP, who may not know that there are resources available to you, is to make sure that we can position and put those individuals in touch with the right resources, and that the advocacy spaces expand so that not everyone who's actively searching out this information has access to this information.
Speaking of that, has the NAACP identified any specific challenges for those communities that have been impacted by the hurricanes. Obviously, logistics is a big issue, and look, even for those people who have been impacted prior to these hurricanes, I would argue that some people were thinking this voting issue, this 2024 election season, could have been foremost in their minds. And even as they are literally trying to survive day by day in the aftermath, they still want to vote. And what do they do?
Yeah, that's a really great question. The kind of advocacy model, or what our voter protection, election protection team has built out the phrase of this for this election cycle is, we fight, you vote. We want everyone concerned with the top issue at hand, and that is casting your ballot. The NAACP is working on the advocacy side, the litigation side, and the voter education aspect to make sure that your vote and everyone in your community's vote is also cast. That is on the voting aspect. We cannot forget that the NAACP, we want to bring resources to our communities. So there's the whole other side, as I've alluded to earlier, of kind of demystifying the alphabet soup, the grants available, the money, the resources for individuals to make sure that their base needs are met. We are not too naive to think that someone who is going through an immense amount of turmoil right now, not even discussing the physical and emotional trauma that is caused from a major storm like this, is not necessarily at top of mind. Voting is not necessarily at top of mind. So it is our goal to make sure that we are pushing out fact-based information in a timely manner around how to receive resources, but then also take those resources one step further to make sure that the right accommodations are being made to cast your ballot. So the things that we've identified really are getting individuals their base needs, but then also pushing information around voting. Because while we are hearing, this is anecdotally as well, but while we are hearing individuals in a Coffee County, Georgia, who are coming to pick up their bottled water, their cases of water, they are asking questions about, can I still vote? Can I still engage? And so we are hearing about individuals getting their needs met, but then expanding just beyond. It's after those needs are met, the next question is, okay, but also we have an election, so how can I participate? So it is trying to address the base needs, but also simultaneously attaching those base needs to an interest in voting.
Well, obviously, based on what we heard Brad Raffensperger say at the beginning of this program about the huge numbers, and certainly that was we saw some huge numbers this morning in Fulton County, Georgia, for example. But before 11 a.m., and those Fulton County obviously not affected by the hurricane, but if those communities are that have not been affected are concerned, the ones that have been affected should also be part of the conversation, as well. I do want to ask you about, you mentioned election protection, and again, this is something that we've been hearing about for years, and it's been something that many nonpartisan organizations have always said, that make sure that all of your ducks are in a row before you vote, whether it's early voting or day of or mail in, or all of the forms to vote. But I guess my question is, for those who vote on election day and then they have problems, we've always been hearing from organizations that say, call election protection. But on the day of, isn't it often just too late?
Yeah, it is by no means too late on election day. Election day is is your last opportunity. So to your point earlier, we'd love for everyone to make a plan early. I'm gonna drop the kids off at soccer practice, then skirt over to my early voting place real quick, cast my ballot, then get back in time for pickup. We would love for everyone to make a plan like that. But in reality, that's not how the world works. And every person is not able to make that plan. So in the event that an individual does run into some issues on election day, and that could be anything ranging from, I am being told I am at the wrong voting precinct, but I know for a
Mhm.
fact this is where I need to vote, to ranging from I was in line before the polling place, quote unquote closed, and I'm told that I'm no longer able to vote. Both of those instances are things that can be resolved and will be resolved on election day. So through the NAACP, we actually have a tool that you can use, which is called our voter incident report form. And that can be accessed by texting the word polls to 20707. And that is polls, POLLS, polls to 20707, where you'll get a text message right back to you with a little form right to your phone. You can fill out that information that is the occurrence that you are running into, and someone from our Office of General Counsel and our legal voter protection team and our grassroots voter protection team, someone will reach out to you. But all of that to say, we anticipate maybe 60%, which is a very large number. 60%
Yeah.
of individuals registered to vote this year are going to vote early. So that 40% that is remaining, that is still of vital importance. We are leaving no vote, no stone unturned in terms of making sure everyone's able to participate in this election. So NAACP, much like our partners in the election protection space, the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights,
Mhm.
Common Cause,
Mhm.
state voices, all of these groups that stand up these state infrastructures that work with local members, local partners, local activists on the ground. They are all working and fighting to ensure that that ballot is cast. So whether you have voted, what's a state, Virginia, who had started voting 45 days before the election, or whether you are an individual who is voting on election day, it is never too late to make sure that your ballot is successfully cast.
I think that's a good place to end this conversation. Terry Sterling, National Director of Campaigns for the NAACP, thank you so very much for sharing this important and helpful information. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you for the time, Harold. Thank you.
That is the Daily Drum for this Tuesday, October 15th. I'm Harold.